Jake stepped outside, coffee in one hand, car keys in the other, ready to kick off his day with the usual routine. But the second his eyes hit the driveway, his heart slammed to a stop. His truck, his brand-new custom-built pride and joy, was gone. Not stolen, no broken glass or signs of forced entry, just vanished like it had never existed. For a split second, he thought he'd lost his mind, packing the driveway like a fool, jabbing the key fob, hopping for a miraculous beep from some hidden corner, nothing. Then right on cue, his neighbor, Old Man Stevens, waddled over with his scruffy dog, shaking his head. "They towed it," he said, casual as if he were mentioning the forecast. Jake blinked, dumbfounded. "What?" Stevens shrugged, patting his dog's head. "Your truck, the HOA had it towed this morning." The words landed like a sucker punch, absurd enough to almost make Jake laugh. Why would they tow his truck from his own driveway? Stevens just pointed him toward Karen, the self-appointed HOA dictator, notorious for her petty fines and power trips. Jake's blood pressure spiked. Karen, of course it was Karen, the queen of absurd rules and neighborhood misery. Towing his truck from his own property, though, that was next-level insanity. He stormed back inside, already dialing the towing company, not even letting them finish their greeting. "This is Jake Carter. My truck was towed from my property this morning, and I need it back now." The guy on the line hesitated. Yeah, that was an HOA request." Jake didn't care who requested it. His truck was legally parked on his land. "Who authorized it?" he demanded. "Karen Whitmore, HOA president," came the reply, confirming what he already knew and sending his anger into overdrive. He took a breath, keeping his voice steady. "Where's my truck?" "It's in our impound lot. You can come pay the—" Jake cut him off, a smirk creeping onto his face. This was the moment the guy would realize the colossal mistake they'd made. "You must be new," Jake said, his tone laced with dangerous amusement, "because if you weren't, you'd know I own the damn tow company." Silence stretched on the line, long and heavy, until the guy stammered. Sir, Jake didn't let him finish. "Go look up my name in your system, quick." A few frantic keystrokes later, a faint "oh crap" slipped out. "That's right," Jake said. "Now, did Karen provide any legal documentation for the tow?" Another pause. No." "Good. I want my truck back in my driveway immediately, and I want a full explanation." Someone also going to tell me why my own employees towed their boss's truck without a second thought. The guy was sweating through the phone now. "Yes, sir, right away, sir." Jake hung up, running a hand through his hair. This was bad, but also hilarious. Karen had ordered a tow from the company he owned. The irony almost made him laugh, but beneath the humor, this was a power move, one she'd pulled thinking she was untouchable. That was about to change. Less than an hour later, a tow truck rolled up, his precious vehicle in tow. The driver, a junior employee, stepped out, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, muttering a weak apology as he fumbled with the paperwork. Jake crossed his arms. "Relax, kid, I'm not mad at you." His gaze flicked toward the HOA office down the street. "I'm mad at the person who thought this was a good idea." With that, he marched straight to Karen's house, ready to face the queen herself. Karen was in her front yard, pruning her already flawless bushes when Jake approached, her lips curling into that signature HOA smugness the second she saw him. "Jake," she said in that condescending tone that made people want to punch walls, "I see your truck was finally removed. You should really read the HOA bylaws." Jake cut her off, his patience already razor-thin. "Karen, I own the tow company." For the first time, she faltered, her pruning shears pausing mid-snip. "Excuse me." "I own the company that towed my truck," he repeated, stepping closer, "which means you ordered my employees to tow their boss's vehicle off his own property. Do you have any idea how insane that is?" Her face twitched, but she recovered fast, brushing it off. "The HOA has rules, Jake. You violated them." "Really?" He folded his arms, challenging her. "Then tell me exactly which rule says I can't park in my own driveway." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, her usual quick rebuttal nowhere to be found. "That's what I thought," he said, his voice low and steady. "Now I want a formal explanation in writing, and I want you to explain to the entire HOA why you abused your power." Karen scoffed, regaining her composure. "I don't have to explain anything. The rules are the rules." Jake let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, Karen, you don't understand what's about to happen, do you?" She narrowed her eyes, her voice dripping with suspicion. "What's that supposed to mean?" He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You tried to flex your authority and it backfired. Now I'm going to make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of scam you're running." Her eyes flickered with the first hint of real fear. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I absolutely would," he shot back. In fact, I think I'll start by holding a little meeting with the HOA board to discuss ethics violations. Karen's face drained of color, and Jake took a step back, still smirking. Enjoy the rest of your day, Karen. I know I will. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there for once, speechless. The battle had begun, and the neighborhood was already buzzing. Homeowners spilled outside, scrolling through their phones, reading the massive pile of evidence Jake had sent out. Every illegal tow, every baseless fine, every power trip Karen had pulled over the years. People who'd been harassed, fined, and bullied by her were finally connecting the dots. The racket was exposed, and there was no turning back. Jake sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, watching it all unfold like it was just another day, but it was. It was the start of Karen's downfall. She stormed off toward the HOA office, probably scrambling to spin the narrative, but there was no talking her way out of this. The evidence was airtight, the homeowners were furious, and her grip on power was slipping fast. Jake decided to let her stew a bit before delivering the knockout punch. An hour later, he strolled toward the HOA office, where a small crowd had already gathered, demanding answers. Karen stood in the doorway, frantically trying to calm them, but her usual patronizing tone wasn't working anymore. "Everyone needs to relax," she said, hands raised like she was addressing a bunch of kids. "There's been a misunderstanding." Jake stepped forward, arms crossed, a faint grin on his face. "A misunderstanding. That's an interesting way to describe illegally towing cars and pocketing the fees." Her face twisted into an ugly scowl. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through his emails with deliberate calm. "You personally requested over 100 tows without proper authorization. You bypassed the board, never filed the right paperwork, and had vehicles removed from private property. Want me to keep going?" Karen's mouth flapped open and shut, like a fish out of water, and Jake knew he had her cornered. Karen stood there, floundering as the crowd's murmurs grew louder, her usual confidence cracking under the weight of Jake's words. He didn't let up, holding up his phone like a weapon loaded with truth. "You've been running this place like your own personal fiefdom, Karen, and it's over." She glared at him, her voice tight with fury. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Jake shrugged, unfazed. "Not really, just not stupid enough to get caught scamming my own neighborhood." Her hands balled into fists, her face flushing red. "You don't understand how hard it is to keep this place running. The HOA needs money to function, and sometimes you have to bend the rules to maintain order." A loud scoff cut through the air. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman Karen had fined for her flower pots, stepped forward, shaking her head. "This isn't about order, it's about power. You've been running this place like your own kingdom." Jake took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "And that kingdom about to fall." Karen's breathing grew heavy, her eyes darting around as the crowd's anger swelled. "You have no authority here, Jake," she snapped. He grinned, pulling out another email and holding it up for all to see. "Funny you should mention authority. I just had a chat with the real HOA board." Karen froze, her bravado faltering. "Turns out," Jake continued, "you've been making decisions without their approval for years. The bylaws require board votes for major actions like vehicle removals, but you never held those votes. Everything you've done has been outside your legal authority." A stunned silence blanketed the crowd, then the outrage erupted anew. "This is ridiculous," Tom, the guy who'd paid $500 to retrieve his car last year, shouted. "How did we let this go on so long?" Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can just waltz in and take me down? I have friends on the board." "They won't," Jake cut her off, turning his phone to show the email. "Oh, you mean the board that just voted you out?" Her face went white as he read aloud. "Effective immediately, Karen Whitmore is removed as HOA president pending further investigation." The homeowners broke into a mix of shocked whispers and cheers, some thrilled, others just dazed that it had actually happened. Karen stumbled back, stammering, No, this is a mistake." Jake didn't relent. "No, Karen, the mistake was thinking you could get away with it forever." The next hour was pure chaos. Homeowners demanded refunds for wrongful tows, the board promised a full audit of Karen's actions, and she tried to argue her way out, but it was useless. She'd lost. Jake watched as she stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. He knew this wasn't the end of her fight. She wasn't the type to go quietly. She'd dig for some excuse, some loophole to claw her way back, but Jake was ready. The neighborhood already felt different. People smiled, chatted, no longer glancing over their shoulders for the next absurd fine. For the first time in years, it felt like a community, not a dictatorship. Later that evening, Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset when Dan called, laughing. "Dude, you actually pulled it off," Jake chuckled. "Told you she'd go down eventually. You think she'll come after you?" Dan asked. "Oh, definitely," Jake said, sipping his coffee, "but I've got a few more tricks up my sleeve." Dan whistled. "Man, I wouldn't want to be in her shoes right now." Jake just smiled. The war wasn't over, but this battle was a decisive win, and Karen had no clue how much worse it was about to get. She'd ruled with fear, but now the tables had turned and Jake was just getting warmed up. Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. She'd spent years lording over the neighborhood, dishing out fines and threats like a petty tyrant, and losing it all in a day had left her seething. Jake knew she'd come back swinging. She thrived on control, and without it she'd claw for any shred she could grab. By morning, the first sign of trouble hit. An email blasted to every homeowner, dripping with Karen's desperation. Gone was her usual commanding tone. Instead, it was a mess of excuses. She claimed the board had overstepped by ousting her, that she'd only ever acted in the community's best interest, and that she was the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by Jake. It was pathetic, almost laughable. Jake read it over his coffee, shaking his head at her delusion. She'd spent years intimidating people into silence, banking on their fear, but that only worked when they had no choice, and now they did. The replies poured in fast. Tom fired back, detailing how she'd scammed him with a $500 tow fee for a made-up rule. Mrs. Thompson sent a scathing email about Karen bullying elderly residents over nonsense like flower pots. One by one, homeowners shared their stories, each peeling back another layer of her corruption. By afternoon, her pitiful plea had backfired spectacularly, uniting the neighborhood against her even more. Jake was savoring the fallout when Dan called, barely containing his glee. "Dude, Karen just showed up at the tow yard." Jake raised an eyebrow. "No way." "Oh yeah," Dan said, "and she's pissed." Jake didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." When he pulled into the yard, there she was, arms crossed, foot tapping like an impatient diva, her car parked half blocking the entrance. Ironic, given her obsession with parking rules. She stormed over the second she saw him. "This is harassment. You had no right to tow my car." Jake leaned against his truck, amused. "Karen, you've got months of unpaid HOA fines on record. The board hasn't wiped them, and you know what that means." Her nostrils flared. "I was the president. I set the fines." "And now you're not," he shot back, "which means they still stand. Per your own rules, unpaid fines lead to a tow." She opened her mouth, then shut it, speechless for once. Dan strolled over, clipboard in hand, grinning. "Standard impound fees $300 plus storage fees every day you leave it here." Karen's face turned crimson. "You expect me to pay?" Jake shrugged. "You made dozens of people pay for your illegal tows. Fair's fair." She looked ready to combust, fists clenched. "This is revenge." "No," Jake said, his smile sharp. "This is justice." For a moment he thought she'd blow up, but instead she spun around only to freeze. Her car wasn't where she'd left it. "Where's my car?" she demanded, spinning back. Dan coughed, feigning innocence. "Oh yeah, it's in the back lot now." "Why?" she growled. He flipped a page on his clipboard. "You're not HOA president anymore, no special privileges. Standard procedure to store long-term impounds in the back." Her teeth clenched so hard Jake could almost hear them grind. "This is insane," he gestured toward the payment counter. "Pay what's owed and it's yours." She glared around, as if expecting a savior, but she'd burned every bridge. With a final scowl, she stomped into the office. Dan chuckled. "Man, that was satisfying." Jake nodded. "And it's not over." That night, someone leaked Karen's HOA financial records, nothing illegal, just a damning list of fines, tows, and fees she'd collected over the years. The totals were staggering, thousands extorted over petty infractions. By morning, talk of lawsuits swirled and demands for refunds grew louder. Karen's reign was crumbling, and Jake was about to make sure it never rose again. The neighborhood woke to a firestorm. Karen's leaked financial records had spread like wildfire, and the numbers didn't lie. Thousands of dollars siphoned from homeowners over years of fabricated fines and questionable tows, all under her personal oversight. By breakfast, people were openly discussing lawsuits, while others demanded she repay every cent she'd wrongfully taken. The HOA announced plans to refund as many victims as possible and overhaul the system to prevent another Karen from ever taking root. She tried to fight back, firing off more emails filled with excuses and deflections, but she was drowning in the backlash. No one was buying it anymore. Jake drove through the streets, watching the transformation unfold. Old HOA notices were torn down, doors repainted in colors Karen had banned, decorations popping up that had once been deemed unauthorized. The place felt lighter, freer, like a weight had lifted. Late that afternoon, a moving truck rolled up to Karen's house. She was leaving, forced out by the very people she'd controlled for so long. She didn't look at anyone, didn't acknowledge the neighborhood she'd ruled with an iron fist, just packed her car and drove off, disappearing around the corner. Jake watched from a distance, a quiet satisfaction settling in. He'd won. Dan pulled up beside him, grinning. So, what now? Jake glanced around at the neighborhood, the battle's scars fading into something new. Now, he said, we make sure this place never gets another Karen. Dan laughed. I'll drink to that. Jake took one last look at her empty house before heading home, knowing the fight wasn't just about her. It was about reclaiming the community. Back inside, he sat on the couch, replaying how it all started, that gut-punch moment when his truck vanished. He hadn't just wanted it back. He'd wanted Karen to pay, not with cash, but with the humiliation she'd earned. She'd terrorized homeowners for years, inventing rules to suit her whims, and crossing him was her fatal misstep. He could have let it go, but that wasn't his style. Power trips had consequences, and he delivered them. Scrolling through his contacts, he'd called Dan that first day, setting the wheels in motion. How fast can we get a report on every HOA tow Karen's ordered in the last 2 years? Dan had delivered in hours, and Jake spent that evening walking the neighborhood, spotting the evidence of her tyranny. Fines for tall grass, trash cans, even a garden gnome. Mrs. Thompson's story about her flower pots had sealed it. Karen wasn't enforcing rules, she was making them up, targeting whoever she pleased. The tow report confirmed it. Over 100 tows, most dubious, many from private property, all requested by Karen without proper channels. It was a racket likely fueled by kickbacks or intimidation, and it was illegal as hell. Jake had set the perfect trap, parking his flashy red sports car in his driveway, baiting her. She'd bitten fast, ordering it towed, and he'd let it play out, ensuring every step was documented. When she strutted up, smug about the tow, he'd dropped the bomb, a mass email exposing her scam to every homeowner. Phones buzzed, chaos erupted, and Karen bolted, her empire collapsing in real time. People poured into the streets, yelling, waving phones, finally seeing the full scope of her corruption. She was finished, and she knew it. Jake leaned back, stretching his arms as the neighborhood's fury took over. He didn't need to chase her, the damage was done. But he wasn't naive. Karen wouldn't vanish quietly. She'd try something, anything, to regain her footing. He was ready, though. The community was waking up, and he'd make damn sure it stayed that way, free from her shadow or anyone else. Karen's departure didn't mean the fight was over. It was just the end of round 1. Jake knew she'd left a mess behind, a broken HOA system ripe for someone else to exploit if they didn't fix it fast. That weekend, an emergency meeting was called, but this time it wasn't a one-woman show. The room was packed. Homeowners who dodged HOA gatherings for years stood shoulder to shoulder, eager to reclaim their voice. Jake watched from the back, amazed at the turnout. Tom, the guy who'd lost $500 to one of Karen's fake rules, stood up first. "We need a new president," he said, cutting through the awkward silence. No one jumped at the role. Karen had poisoned it with her toxicity. Then someone coughed and piped up, "I nominate Jake." Jake nearly choked on his water, head snapping up as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Whoa, hold on," he said, raising a hand. "That's not why I did this." Dan smirked from the corner. "Sounds like a great idea to me." Jake shook his head, insistent. "Look, I just wanted to fix the problem, not run the show." Tom crossed his arms, undeterred. "And that's why you should. We've had power-hungry types like Karen for too long. Maybe it's time for someone who actually cares about this place." Nods spread through the room, and Jake sighed, rubbing his neck. He'd never wanted to touch the HOA, but as he scanned the faces, people who'd been bullied and silenced for years, he saw the risk. If he didn't step up, someone worse might. "Fine," he said at last, "but on one condition: we overhaul the whole system. No more power trips, no more ridiculous fines, no more abuse. The HOA serves the community, not the other way around." The room burst into applause, a wave of relief washing over them. Over the next few weeks, the changes rolled out fast. Karen's absurd rules, bans on flower pots, lawn chairs, trash cans out an extra hour, were scrapped. Homeowners collaborated on a new system, one grounded in fairness, focusing on real priorities like safety and property values, not petty control. For the first time, people had a say, and it showed. The vibe shifted. Kids played outside without parents fearing fines. Neighbors chatted over fences, hosting barbecues instead of hiding indoors. It felt like a real neighborhood again, not a dictatorship's playground. One evening, Jake sat in his driveway, soaking in the transformation, when Dan pulled up, grinning. "You know," Dan said, leaning against his truck, "you might have actually done something good here." Jake chuckled. "Don't let it go to my head." Dan nodded toward Corinne's old house, now vacant. "What do you think happens with that place?" "No idea," Jake shrugged. "Someone new will move in eventually." Dan smirked. "What if they're worse than Corinne?" Jake laughed. "Then we'll be ready." As if on cue, kids raced by on bikes, laughing, while neighbors waved from their yards, smiling instead of scowling. The air felt lighter, and Jake took a deep breath, savoring it. Things were how they should be, no more Corinne, no more fear, just a community finding its footing. But he wasn't naive. Corinne's exit didn't erase her influence overnight. She'd try something, revenge, a loophole, anything to slink back. He'd seen her type before. Control freaks didn't fade quietly. That night he got a call from Dan. "Dude, she's at the tow yard again, raising hell." Jake grinned. He'd expected this. "What's she want?" "Her car," Dan said, laughing. "She's refusing to pay the fees." Jake leaned back. "Let her stew. She'll either pay or lose it." Corinne was desperate, grasping at straws, but Jake had the upper hand now, and he wasn't about to let her wiggle free. Corinne's latest stunt at the tow yard was no surprise. Jake had pegged her as too stubborn to bow out gracefully. She'd stormed in, demanding her car without paying the mounting fees, her voice shrill enough to rattle the windows. Dan had called Jake right after, barely holding back laughter. "She's losing it, man, threatening lawsuits, saying we're stealing from her." Jake smirked, picturing her red-faced and flailing. "Let her try. She's got no leg to stand on. Those fines are still on the books, and she wrote the damn rules." Dan chuckled. "She's got till tomorrow to pay, or it's auction time." Jake nodded. "Good, keep me posted." He hung up, leaning back on his porch, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in gold. Corinne's desperation was almost pitiful, but he wasn't about to feel sorry for her. She'd built this trap herself. The next morning, word spread fast. She'd caved, paid the fees, and retrieved her car, but not without a screaming match that left half the tow yard staff in stitches. It was a small win, but a satisfying one. She was running out of moves. Meanwhile, the neighborhood kept healing. The HOA's new system took root, with transparent meetings and fair rules replacing Corinne's reign of chaos. People weren't just complying, they were participating, pitching ideas for community events, even planning that barbecue to celebrate her exit. Jake watched it unfold from his driveway, sipping coffee, marveling at how fast things had flipped. A week later, he sat on his porch as the last of Corinne's belongings were hauled into a moving truck. She was really gone now, the final chapter of her downfall sealed. Homeowners mingled outside, chatting freely, some laughing about the absurdity of her rules, like the guy fined for a basketball hoop, now proudly dunking in his driveway. Dan pulled up, tossing Jake a soda before plopping onto the railing. "So that's it, huh? Wicked Witch is out of here." Jake cracked the can open, smirking. "Looks like it. Feels kinda surreal." Dan nodded, watching the truck rumble off. "She didn't even wave goodbye." "Good riddance," Jake said, taking a sip. Corinne hadn't looked back, just drove away, a bad memory finally fatting. He'd expected more fight, but even she couldn't deny the tide had turned. Without power, she had nothing left. With her gone, the real work kicked in. The HOA was a mess after years of her nonsense, a breeding ground for petty tyrants if they didn't rebuild it right. Jake hadn't wanted the presidency, but he'd taken it to steer things clear of another Corinne. Changes were working. People showed up to meetings, eager to shape their future, not just dodge fines. Tom had been right. They needed someone who cared, not someone who craved control. Still, Jake stayed vigilant. Corinne's defeat didn't mean the war was over. She'd left scars, and he knew she'd stew on this, maybe even plot a comeback. That evening, Dan called again, voice low. "Heard a rumor she's talking to some old board buddies, trying to stir something up." Jake's jaw tightened. "Figures, what's she got?" "Not much," Dan said. "Just noise so far, but she's pissed." Jake grinned. "Let her be. We've got the neighborhood now. She's got nothing." He hung up, stepping outside to a chorus of kids laughing and neighbors waving. The place felt alive, reclaimed. Corinne could scheme all she wanted, but the power was back where it belonged, with the people. Jake wasn't just satisfied, he was ready. If she came back swinging, he'd have more than a few tricks waiting. For now, though, he savored the quiet victory, knowing he'd helped turn a dictatorship into a community worth fighting for. The neighborhood hummed with a new energy. Karen's moving truck was long gone, and the air felt cleaner without her shadow looming. Jake leaned against his porch railing, watching kids race bikes down the street while neighbors fired up grills for the barbecue they'd planned to celebrate her exit. It was the kind of scene she'd defined into oblivion, too noisy, too chaotic, too alive. Now it was just right. Dan swung by, parking his truck and hopping out with a grin. "Man, look at this place." "You'd think we won the lottery, not just ditched a dictator." Jake laughed, nodding. "Feels like it, though." They clinked soda cans, toasting the victory as smoke from the grills curled into the evening sky. The HOA's overhaul was in full swing. Meetings were packed, rules made sense, and people actually smiled at each other. Jake hadn't wanted the president gig, but he'd stuck with it, determined to keep the system honest. It was working. No more absurd fines, no more power trips, just a community pulling together. Still, he kept one eye open. Karen's silence after paying her tow fees felt too quiet. She wasn't the type to slink off forever. Dan had heard whispers of her cozying up to old board cronies, maybe plotting a comeback, but Jake wasn't worried. She'd lost her grip, and the neighborhood was too awake now to fall for her tricks again. If she tried anything, he'd be ready. Hell, he'd relish the chance to bury her schemes for good. For now, though, the focus was forward. The HOA dug into its finances, refunding wrongful fines where they could, and the audit of Karen's reign painted a grim picture, thousands pocketed from her racket, some likely lining her own pockets. Lawsuits were still on the table, but most just wanted her gone, not their money back. Jake figured she'd skip town entirely once the legal heat got too close. She wasn't built for accountability. That night the barbecue lit up the block, laughter and music spilling into the streets. Tom dunked a basketball in his driveway, grinning at Jake. "Couldn't do this a month ago without a $200 fine." Mrs. Thompson waved from her porch, flower pots proudly on display. "Thanks for this, Jake," she called. He waved back, shrugging. "Wasn't just me." But it kinda was. He'd sparked it, turned anger into action, and toppled a tyrant. Dan sidled up, smirking. "You're a hero now, you know that?" "Don't start," Jake groaned, but he couldn't hide a small grin. The night stretched on, warm and easy, the kind of evening Karen's rules had stolen for years. As it wound down, Jake sat in his driveway, staring at her old house, empty, waiting for someone new. Dan followed his gaze. "Think the next one'll be trouble?" "Maybe," Jake said, "but we'll handle it." No more Karen's slipping through. Dan nodded, and they sat in comfortable silence, the neighborhood alive around them. It wasn't perfect. Rebuilding took time, and scars lingered, but it was theirs again. Jake thought back to that morning his truck vanished, the fury that kicked this all off. He hadn't just wanted it back, he'd wanted justice, and he'd gotten it. Karen had underestimated him, thought her little empire was untouchable, but she'd picked the wrong fight. Now she was a memory, and the community was stronger for it. He stood, stretching, and headed inside, leaving the porch light on. The war might not be over. Karen could still lurk, scheming, but this battle was his, and the neighborhood was free. For the first time in years, it felt like home, and that was worth every second of the fight. Jake smiled to himself, knowing whatever came next, they'd face it together and win.